In this tutorial, we are going to cover how to validate specific users on a web app with Google Apps Groups. Imagine you are building a Google web app and you want to give only a specific group of people access. Well, when you deploy your web app, you can give a broad permission for people to view or access your web app, but you can't really narrow it down to the few people that you want to give access to. You might be able to narrow it down to a Google Workspace domain account if you have one of those, but that's about as close as you can get. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to validate only certain users to access your Google Apps Groups web app, even before the HTML is loaded onto their page. So let me show you what we're going to do first, and then we'll get stuck into the code. So what I have here is a Google Doc, and I only want those people who have edit permission to this document to be able to access my web app. So as you can see here, when I click share, I've got a list of users who have various levels of permissions. So I've got editors, and I've got one who has view access, and then I've got a Google group that has multiple users who have edit access to the document. So when I run my web app for the first time, and let's say I'm in the owner account, which is this one, and I enter in the URL to the web app, it's just going to come up with something simple like you are worthy. So obviously you replace you are worthy with your web app that your users have access to. Alternatively, if someone doesn't have access to the document or they have only view access, then you don't want them to have that you are worthy page. So you want to present them with a separate page that tells them that they don't have access. In our case, we are going to rudely say you are not worthy. So how do we do all this? Well, let's get started with our code. Let's head back into your Google Apps Script IDE, and we will start by naming our app script validate users on a web app. On a web app. Cool. Hit rename. So quite often your web app will be a separate page, and I'd like to keep it as a separate page, and maybe your code.js might be your main run information. So let's rename this, and we can put in code.js later. So we'll rename this to web app and hit enter. And then to run your web app, you need to use a doGet function. Okay, so once this doGet function is found, then it will read through the doGet function to enable it to be deployed. Simple as that. We'll start off with a basic web app file, and then we'll expand on that as we go. If you've had a look at the docs before, you'll probably see something similar to this. So let's go const, and we'll call our constant variable HTML, and that's equal to, and we're going to make use of the HTML service here, which is a Google Apps Script class, and we'll use create template from file, but you can use create HTML output from file too. It's up to you. I just use this more often than not. And inside this is the name of the file, and we will create that file in a moment, but let's just call this HTML file as our placeholder. And let's get our logic together for the HTML service. So next, for template, we need to evaluate it. And then we'll set our title. And we will call this the worthy. So it looks like we are starting a cult. And in our cult of goat worshippers, we only want to give people certain access, and they are the worthy. So let's just do a little bit more logic, and we'll set our X-frame options mode here, and we'll set that to HTML service again, and X-frame options mode, and we want allow all, and that just allows the HTML to be embedded in a document if you want to. Okay, and then last we'll add in some meta tags. Add tag. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial, but we'll add it in. So we'll go view, forward, and we'll go comma. And then we want, call this width. We'll set the width to the device. And we'll set the initial scale, dash scale, and we'll set that to 1. So all our scaling sorted out as soon as the web app is loaded. Awesome. And we want to set our placeholder to something, and our first one, we'll call it our index file. So we'll say, there's a reason why I'm using let instead of const here, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So we'll say HTML, blah, blah, blah. I'll say HTML file equals, and we'll call this one index, which is going to be the main one if the user has been validated successfully. And down here, so we finished our logic, and what we need to do for our doGet function to run successfully is to return HTML, colon, cool bananas. Put a colon there to make it look pretty as well. Awesome, so this won't run well yet. What we need to do is create our index file, and this will be our UR-worthy file, so this one here. Okay. So let's go to File here and add a file, and let's create a HTML file that we call index. All right, and it's going to look super simple. All we're going to do in our body is we'll create a h1 tag, and we'll style that tag to color blue. And we'll close our HTML here, and yeah, thank you. And we'll say, you are worthy. You legend. Nice. So we'll save that, Control S, and go back to our web app. And while we're at it, let's head back to Index.html, and we will see if this copies. So we'll go make a copy, see what happens here. And let's call this one non-user. So this is the you are not worthy. So if they're not validated as an editor of the document. Excellent. So make sure I've clicked on non-user. Let's change the style to red, and we will add in you are not worthy. Hit Control S here, and we're good. All right, so we've finished our doGet function. We should be able to deploy this. So let's do our initial deployment and go up the top here and click on deploy, new deployment. And then we need to select our type. So this little edit wheel here, and we'll select web app, and we'll say just initial test deployment. And we want our web app to be accessed by all our users. So we want them to execute this web app so they can get their own unique information. And it also helps us validate them as well. So we're going to change this to user accessing the web app. And we want to make this for anyone with a Google account. Now, if you're working on a Google Workspace domain account, a business account, you'll also see one that says anyone within your domain as well. So you can choose one of those two options, but not only myself. So for us, we're just going to click anyone with Google account, and then we'll click on deploy. Okay, so now we've got our deployment URL. Now we can hit copy here and click done, and we can open up a new page. This is going to be different to this one because this was in a previous code. So I'm going to hit Control V to paste it in and hit enter and see if our code ran successfully. All right, success. We've got you are worthy here. Now we want to test this out with the you are not worthy to make sure it's working as well. And we can't do that with a deployment, but we can do it with a test deployment. Let's go in and update the HTML file variable to the non-user and hit save, Control S. And let's just use a test deployment here so we don't have to update the original deployment. So test deployment. And that'll give us a test URL we can try out here, and we'll hit copy and done. And I'll open up a new tab, and let's see if this says you are not worthy. Excellent, we are not worthy. Never been so excited about not being worthy before. Awesome. Okay, so we've got our two HTML files working successfully inside our web app. Now we can start working on our validation. Okay, so what we're going to do is create a function called validate. And that's going to return either true if they're validated or false if they're not validated. And when it returns true, we want the Index.html to run. And when it returns false, we want the NonUser.html to run. So that's why I've left the HTML file variable here as let so it can change. So let's build in this logic first in our doGet because it's pretty simple. And before we even do that, we're going to need to get two variables as well. So our first one is going to be our user email. And this is one of the beauties of setting up our deployment so it can be opened with the user account, not our account, is that we can use the session class. So let's go const, go user email, and then we are going to use the Google Apps Script session class to get the active users, which is the person accessing the web app, there, and we want their email, which is here. Now, this will result in a permissions request when they load the web app for the first time now, but I'd imagine that you would have other permissions as you build out your web app as well. So this will get the users who is accessing the web app their email account. Bonza. Next, we'll go next word const, and we need to get a file ID. File ID. And we'll make that equal to, and that's going to be the ID for this Google Doc here for patterns of the goat. So we're going to select this full ID up to here and hit Control-C to copy, and then we can paste that in here. You could also make that a global variable. It's totally up to you. All right, so we've got two variables that we're going to use to validate our incoming users. So next, we're going to go const, and we're going to create the constant is valid. So if the user is valid. And this variable will equal our returned value from our validate function, which would either be true if the user is valid or false if they're not. So we'll type in validate, our function, and the validate function takes two arguments. Yep, you guessed it, the user email and the file ID. So let's type in user email and file ID. Nice. Okay, so once we have true or false for is valid, we can then use a ternary operator to decide which of the HTML files we need to use. Delete that row. And instead of having our non-user here, we'll delete this out. Using our ternary operator, we'll put a brackets and we'll say is valid. So if it is valid, so it's true, a little question mark here, we want to use the Index.html. Or if it's false, so they're not validated, we want to use the non-user HTML. And now that's all we need to do for our doGet file. Cool. All right, so let's move down and create our validate function. Okay, so we'll type in function here and we'll say validate and open up our brackets, and it has two parameters as we said before, and that is email and file ID. Okay. So the first thing we need to do for our validate function is have a placeholder that we're going to return back to the doGet function. And that will go back into this is valid variable here, and that is going to be simply let is valid equal false. So immediately the user is not valid unless something inside this function tells us that the user is valid. So the first thing I'm going to do is create two variables based on two functions that are immediately invoked. Why am I invoking them immediately? Well, it makes it a little bit neater in the code below, and they have to be invoked regardless, so we may as well get them set up and placed inside the variable ready to be called later. So the first one we're going to have is our email list, and we will set this email list to const equals email list. And to create an immediately invoked function, we put it inside two sets of braces here. Let's make that pretty with a semicolon. And then we'll use an arrow function on this. Oh, I didn't put equals here, sorry. And let's use an arrow function on this. So we'll put in some empty brackets because we don't have an argument. And we'll say equals arrow and then curly braces, and then we'll hit enter. And the first thing we need to do is set a file. So we'll say var for variable file. And we don't have anything in it, so we'll just leave it as that for now. And we'll use this for our try catch. Next, we need to determine if the user actually has permission or actually has access to the patterns of the Goat document. If they don't, and we try and search for them, it's going to come up with an error because their access is denied, right? So we need to put this in a try catch statement. So let's go try. And let's try, and we'll use file here. We'll store this file information in file. We'll say equals, and we'll use the Google Apps Scripts drive app class here, and we can use the get file by ID method. And inside here we need to put the ID of the file, and that's going to be the file ID. So I'm going to double click that, copy it, and click down in between the two brackets here and paste it. Nice. So if the user does have access, we're not going to have any issues. It's just going to get that file. If they don't have access, it's going to throw an error. We're going to catch that error, and we can put an E for error just out of habit. And what we're going to do here is we'll return false to show that the user doesn't have access. And we'll handle that false returned to the email list in a moment. Okay, so once we've tested to see if the user has access, we need to then get a list of all the users who have edit permission in the file. So let's return that. So we'll return, we'll say file, get, editors. That will give us an array of all the editors, and from there we can iterate through each one and then get the editor's email. So let's then type in map. And to get each email in that array only, because that's all we need, and we'll just use the JavaScript map method. And we will say for each editor, and a little arrow function again, and curly braces are open, and we'll return editor get email. Nice. Okay, so if the user is successful and they can access the file, then we want to get a list of all the editors in that file and return that and put it inside an email list. If they're unsuccessful and they don't have access, we want it to return false and store that in our email list variable. Our next step is then to check if they did or didn't have access to this file and then return true or false from the validate function. So let's go if email list is false, so we can say if not email list, which basically says if email list is false, then we will set is valid to false. We could probably just return false, but let's keep the logic. Makes it easier to read. Then we'll return is valid. So if they didn't have access, it returns that they're false. They don't have access at all to the file, and then that'll go back to the doGet function, and it will set this variable to false and display non-user. You might think we'd stop there, but unfortunately, using the get editors method here only gets a list of editors. It could be a Google group who have editor permission, or it could be individuals. So if we have a user who is a member of a group, then they won't be recognized in our check here. So what we need to do is get the group email list and check to see if there are any group emails in which the user is a member of. What we're going to do is go const. We'll say group email list and then equals, and we'll go brackets to run it immediately, and then our little arrow function, and curly brackets, and cool. So this time around, we want to first set a variable to so this is a placeholder variable to is member of if of group. So this will look through all the editor emails in the list and see if they are a member of that group. So if they are, we'll set this to false to say that they're not, but if they are, we'll set it to true. Great. What we can do here is use the groups app, Google Apps Script API, and this will allow us to get the user's group. So get all the groups that the user is a member of by using get groups. And this will give them an array of objects for each group. Inside each group will be the get email method. So let's iterate through that get groups that we've just grabbed. So we'll go map again. And inside our map, we'll say group. So for each group, we'll return a little function here, little arrow function again. And we just want to return group.get email. Nice. Okay, so once we've got the email, we can then chain this onto JavaScript for each method. And we're going to use this to test to see if any of the emails in the email list matches the user's list of groups. And if it does, we're going to change is member of a group to true. So we got for each, I'll open up brackets again, create a little arrow function. So each group, and curly braces, enter. So for each group, we want to say if our email list, and that's what we created up here on line 23. So if our email list includes, so we're using the includes, I think it's ECMAScript 6 JavaScript method here. And this method just basically says if there is a value inside the includes bracket inside the array, then it will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. So it includes, and that's going to be our group. So if it includes group, then we want to update our is member of group to equal true. Nice. Oh, I think I made a mistake there. Let's just copy that. Oh, no, I haven't. It's all good. All right. And once that process is done, so that's our if statement here. And then that's the closure. That's the closing bracket for the for each. And then once that's done, we want to return either true or false for our group email list. So return is member of group. And then that closure function is complete. Nice. So the last thing we need to do is to use the email list to check to see if the current user's email is included in that list, or if the current user's email is in the groups and that group is included in the email list. So let's go from there. So we'll say if email list, and we're going to use includes again, and it's going to be the user's email. So if their email is in that email list, what then we want to set is valid to equal true. Alternatively, else if the group email list is true, then we want to set is valid to equal true. Donezo. Great. And then the last thing we need to do is to return is valid. All right. We'll save. And we'll give it a little preliminary test, So we'll use our test script. So I've got it here, but let's just close that and go back and go to deploy, test deployment, and grab the test deployment script again, hit copy. And we'll open up a new tab and hit Control-V for paste. And now we've got some permissions to accept. So review permissions. Yep, all good. I trust it, I wrote it. And we, fingers crossed it worked, success. So you are worthy, that worked out well. Bit of a problem here though is that we can't use the test URL unless we shared the project with other people. So what we'll need to do is deploy this. So we'll go new deployment, and this will update the deployment with a new URL. So we'll keep all these values the same, and we'll just say validate check and hit deploy. And I'll grab this URL. So I hit copy there. I'm just going to open it up into an account I know that does not have permission, and it's this one here. Let's just type in google.com so it's not confusing for you. Okay, and then we'll just paste this in, and it should say you are not worthy once we go through all the permission process. So at least that's showing that part is working successfully. Advanced, and validate, yep, allow, and you are not worthy. So success, our little app has worked successfully. So now our validate function allows us to decide before the HTML is actually loaded onto the screen whether or not the user should have access or not. And if they do have access, they have access to whatever you want to build inside your Index.html. And if they don't, you can create a nice little message to say, I'm sorry, you don't have access to this document, and some more information that follows. That's it for learning how to validate users on a web app. I do go into more detail on my website, and there's a link in the description below about further discussions on how to validate users on a web app. So if you're interested, check it out there. There's links to the code if you want to just copy and paste it in for your own project. And if you enjoyed the tutorial and want to see more like this, please click like and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next tutorial.